Alright, I saw two movies this week, so let's just go into those. We'll start with Detective Pikachu. This is something that I really had no idea how I was going to feel about it, because despite how much of a broken record I may sound like, I have made it abundantly clear many times before that I get sick of Ryan Reynolds very, very quickly and very, very easily. And then there's the whole Pokemon aspect, which is interesting because Pokemon was something I was really, and I don't mean this to sound condescending or anything at all, but up until I was about 10 or 11 is when I was really into Pokemon. And then it's not like I sort of like grew out of it or it's something that I just started disliking. I don't even remember what happened. I just kind of gradually moved away from it somehow. But still, the couple of things that kind of remained were there is I still actually have an N64 that I play with my brother occasionally, just for the nostalgia factor, I guess. And one of the games we still play pretty regularly is Pokemon Stadium. And I used to be into really, like, pretty much just about every aspect of it, and it was like probably a couple of years or so after the first movie came out, I think is when I remember kind of drifting off. To the point, I was so far away from it, I had no idea that this was like its own game. I had, like, when I heard the title Detective Pikachu, I had just assumed that Ryan Reynolds was taking the character and just doing whatever the hell. But yeah, obviously, much to my surprise, this is an actual game in itself. And just to kind of get an idea, I looked at one of those long play YouTube videos of the game and just kind of skimmed through it just to see exactly what the concept was, just to have an idea going in, because I didn't want to feel too blind since I'd mostly be playing catch up with myself, despite the fact that I still there were every now and then there was like one that I didn't recognize at all, but for the most part, I remember them pretty vividly. And some names that I have not thought of in like years, like well over a decade even, just immediately came to me when I would see one pop up, which is really nice. Yeah, so going into that, there is also the Ryan Reynolds factor of him playing Pikachu, which, once again, before I knew the concept of the game, it was like, so is the gimmick just going to be that it's him, saying Pikachu's name when he speaks? But the thing is that, and at first I was like, well, it's not like we wouldn't have seen that before, because we've got, the likes of Vin Diesel playing Groot, or what Sean Penn was doing in the Angry Birds movie, stuff like that. But then, yeah, later on I learned that in the game he actually does talk, and it's the whole where it's the kid can hear him and all that, but he still sounds like that to everybody around him, so that, and it eventually made sense to me, so going into it also talking about the world, where it's basically, I saw, before I went in, I heard a lot of comparisons to Zootopia, just with Pokemon, which also makes sense. Um, but it does kind of make you question how much they can pull it off in regards to doing that in live action with all the CGI going on, and like kind of shockingly well they pull it off to a point that I really wasn't giving this movie like enough like confidence when I went into it. But like not that I was hating it going in or thinking it was going to be terrible, but I really didn't imagine they would be able to pull this off as well as they did. I know the director is the guy that did Goosebumps. When you look at that, that could really Goosebumps is so middle ground where it could have been terrible, but it also could have been great, and it found that middle ground. When you hear it's the same director, it's kind of like the same thing where it really could have gone either direction and probably wouldn't have been that surprising. Um, but so yeah, and that's more or less. I think this is a better movie than Goosebumps. But still, it was still kind of impressive almost at every turn, even if sometimes it feels maybe a bit sloppy at times. But that's kind of really easy to get over. This is one of those cases where I could feel myself fighting myself throughout the movie, especially by the time it got to the end, where it was like, I was sort of trying to find, like, faults in it and all that, and then there was the whole, I don't know how I feel about this, and it's like, yeah, it's okay, I guess. But then the other side of my brain just kept saying, just shut the fuck up. You clearly like it. Just give in and like it as it goes on. Because I feel like it got even better as it went. Because I did kind of... it did feel like a bit of a shaky start, especially with at first I wasn't sure how to feel about Justice Smith, who is our lead live action character, who is mainly amazing here because he's able to, the way he plays off the Pikachu that obviously when he was filming this wasn't there, and the fact that he can have this back and forth like they're in the same place, despite the fact that there are like really seasoned actors that still have trouble doing that kind of thing convincingly. And this just seems so effortless to him. Like, really, the weakest parts for him are when he's just sort of speaking in general. Like in the one of the opening scenes, when he gets the news that his father has been in a car accident and potentially killed. There's this delivery of him saying, "That was the police department. There's been an accident." But the way he says that is just so blank and emotionless. It wasn't until they straight up said that somebody really close to him, like a father, was in this accident. You never would have guessed looking at him, despite how, estranged they may have been at the time still. It was just a weirdly vacant scene to get us there. But then once he got into the world, everything started to sort of mesh well together. We even get the whole exposition video with Bill Nye and all his backstory while he's on his way there. That kind of gives us the idea of the world and the Pokemon and exactly what they do and what they are, which felt like it was, for people that probably know just about all of it, it would just kind of feel like this blatant exposition machine going. But it's also extremely helpful for the people that are going in like totally blind to the whole thing, or people like me who had like catching up to do. And so that was kind of a nice way to introduce that without it seeming to like just have, because in a movie like this where there's like so much of the world building aspect, a lot of movies like this fall under the whole thing where we're just getting exposition from beginning to end. Like every new scene has to have some character do some giant exposition dump. But this kind of the scene at the beginning more or less sets it up enough to where when we go from scene to scene, it just kind of explains itself as it goes without being overbearing about it, which is really good. And some of these settings in particular are really great. I really love the whole, like that underground battle arena is really, it kind of all the movies to reference, it sort of reminded me of a set that would have been in like Real Steel, the Hugh Jackman fighting robots movie. But once again, executed in a much better and more creative way. And there's also kind of, you start to kind of worry a little bit about how much, as far as the CGI and how well it's going to be, because there's oftentimes where when movies have this much CGI in them, a lot of it's going to look particularly half-assed. And occasionally there's a moment where you get a sense that the live-action actors and the Pokemon aren't necessarily in the same place, but they're really few and far between. There was even one moment where I kind of felt that way, but then there was like another effect in there that like helped bring it together. And that's when he's on his way there to the city, and there's a Lickitung that's bothering him and licks him in the face. And when he was just kind of, when they were standing there together at first and he was licking him, it was like, you can kind of see where the CGI is and where the live action is a little too clearly. But then the slobber from the tongue starts to drip down his face. And it's just like this really realistic quality that's enough to blend the two together without looking too disconnected. So just little things like that can make the whole thing work if they're done well enough. So that's really great also. And then there's the character of Pikachu himself, which, once again, I did see the... I was won over by how he looked CGI-wise in the fake video that Ryan Reynolds put out that was supposedly the movie, and it was just Pikachu dancing for an hour and 42 minutes. And it's like, oh, okay, if that's what he actually looks like in the movie, then that's, really good and actually visually appealing, which I feel like that's something that probably would have been really hard to do also. When you hear about the fact that the Pokemon are going to be put into like a live-action world through CGI, you can imagine some of them may not translate very well, but they shockingly do. But obviously he's also got the Ryan Reynolds thing going on, where he's basically a Ryan Reynolds character inside Pikachu, because that's all Ryan Reynolds is really capable of, at least anymore. Occasionally he tries to throw a surprise at us, but I think he's found a little... Because that's kind of the thing that irks me about him a little bit is that I'm sure he's got the talent, but when you look at stuff like Deadpool and now this, and he's keeps talking up that stoner Home Alone movie that he wants to do, and it's like it seems less like he wants to do more interesting things like The Voices or The Nines or something like that, or Buried. And now it just seems like he's more focused on being the internet's golden boy, and it's just sort of seems like the same shit all the time in every character now, no matter how different they are. Um, but yeah, and that's the thing is that the fact that people basically went in expecting and more or less hoping that this was going to basically be Deadpool in a Pikachu body, and that's basically what they get, just a PG version of it. Sometimes he sneaks some stuff in there that either was meant to be suggestive or I'm perverted and just took it as suggestive. Like, for instance, he was able to sneak stuff in potentially, like when he's talking about the way people approach him and how they like pinch his cheeks and they poke him and all that, and then just really casually says, sometimes they stick a finger in me, and then he just goes right on to the next thing, and you're left wondering where exactly what place on him we're talking about, but then it just moves on. So yeah, and he did, do his Ryan Reynolds thing, making press, talking about stuff like, hey, there's, R-rated audio cuts that I did that weren't going to make it into the movie, obviously, and yeah, so that's kind of all. So that wasn't really that appealing to me going in, thinking about that. But for the most part, he does still manage to make it work. And I got, like I said, the more it goes on, the more I was able to get used to it, and sort of the voice and the Pikachu itself came together to where it was. Yeah, it was fine. But then there's also stuff that they throw in there that's... I'm sure this is one of those movies where you can find just about everything. It's just something in the background anywhere. The one that I noticed immediately, before they even cut to it, just by the sound, I knew exactly what it was before they cut to it. And it's really bizarre that it's here, and it's certainly not in the background. It's like shown to us blatantly. They're not trying to hide this reference at all. When Justice Smith walks into his dad's apartment, and of course his dad is like, I forget exactly what his title was, but in that detective vein, and he's apparently watching Angels with Filthy Souls, the fake gangster movie from Home Alone, which has now come up again, and yeah, and that's just there. Apparently it exists in this world also. Which I'm not sure exactly rights-wise how that's the case, given that this is Warner Brothers, but it doesn't matter. So, yeah, and every now and then there is some stuff that just feels like a plot device kind of thrown in, like the whole thing with Pikachu's memories. Feels like something that was kind of forced into the writing to make sure we don't quite get from point A to point B so quickly. But for the most part, it's just kind of basically a lazy way to pull that off, an uncreative way, I guess I'd say, to pull that off. And every now and then there's a character that's completely underutilized, like the girl that sort of gets him, that's sort of been waiting for him and sort of gets him involved in the mystery. And then there's like Ken Watanabe as his dad's superior, I think. And Ken Watanabe is one of those cases where when they got him, it's like, oh, this part must be significant in some way, but it's not really. He just kind of does that part exactly as you'd expect. And of course, we've got Bill Nye here that gets to have some fun, though I don't know how much you can really say about that without going into some of the turns that the movie has up its sleeve, which is, it has quite a few. Some of which are like genuinely surprising, believe it or not. I don't know if it's just because it wasn't a movie I was looking for story turns in. I mean, there's a couple of things where you can tell they're blatantly hiding one or two things, and you kind of know from a mile away what the reveals are going to be. But there's still some surprises in there also, as far as those go. Like I said, even if sometimes it feels a bit forced and them kind of really having to work at this story to get it where it needs to go, and not necessarily in the, creative sense. Something that's doesn't really match the creativity that clearly went in the visual aesthetic that it has, so there is that. And as far as it being funny, it does certainly have its moments, and Pikachu himself certainly has some moments, but I think they peaked with the Mr. Mime scene. And it's one of those scenes that kind of got better as it went also, because I was already in hysterics when they first ran into him, when he made his getaway or attempted to make his getaway, and then the follow up scene, it just kind of gets better and better. So that whole Mr. Mime thing is just absolute gold. And if the whole movie had been that funny, they probably would have had something extremely special on their hands, to that on top of the creativity it's got. Um, but it's also got some, like I said, I don't know how much is saying too much, but there's one particular big reveal, like, in the middle, and sort of an action scene sort of way. Not anything in the climax, but shortly before that, this really spectacular scene. And the climax itself also really won me over. Also, even though it does go in, like, directions that may not have been the most thought out, but given this, it's kind of hard to, like, really go into the whole technical stuff about what makes sense and what doesn't. After a while, you have to wonder when it's really not the point, whether something fully makes sense or not when you watch something like this. Though we do get a climax that does look awfully similar, especially if you've watched Tim Burton's first Batman movie recently. But still, it's a really big and satisfying climax. Like I said, actually has story turns that are genuinely surprising. And just has this all-around appeal to it throughout it. Like I said, it was almost like I was fighting myself to just stop overthinking it and just take it for what it was. And yeah, so I actually did really like this, even if I wasn't aware of that right away. And like I said, I don't even know what I had against it going in, but yeah, so I actually do really like it, and I should probably get less apologetic about that as it goes on. So yes, I do really like it. So there's that. And then we'll talk about Long Shot, which is the new romantic comedy with Seth Rogen and Charlize Theron that actually came out last week, but I only just got to it now. So, not something I was in a particular hurry for, even despite the pretty universal critical acclaim it's been getting, interestingly enough. But the thing is that I do find that when it comes to romantic comedies, even when they're critically acclaimed and are seen as, like, subverting the genre a little bit, or just taking things in a slightly different direction to give it more appeal, I still just, I don't know, every now and then there's a romantic comedy where it's like, okay, yeah, and you kind of let the guard down, and even if it's, just a guilty pleasure, still there's some enjoyment factor to it. But it's been a genre that's been kind of harder and harder for me to, like, really kind of just surrender to, I guess. So, and we've got, because the thing here is that our director is Jonathan Levine, who has worked with Rogen 2 other times. They did 50-50 together, and they did The Night Before. And it's sort of like, which are obviously 2 different movies, despite the Rogen-Joseph Gordon-Levitt teamings, but the thing here is that the movie seems to want to have The Night Before's broad comedy and 50-50 sincerity and put them together. Because he's kind of really done some interesting things with genre. Like, I really like Warm Bodies, which he did also, where he somehow made a romantic comedy out of a zombie movie, and it worked in this really weird way. He also did The Whackness, which I didn't care too much for, but it's clear the guy has range. So we take this whole thing, and then we've got 2 screenwriters. We've got the guy that wrote The Interview and the woman that wrote The Post. Which, once again, despite Bob Odenkirk, those things don't have a whole lot in common, The Post and this movie. But combine the writer of The Interview and the writer of The Post, and I guess this seems like a logical outcome in some way. I don't know. So I mentioned Odenkirk, who is playing the president that Charlize is the Secretary of State for, and the thing here is that he is a TV actor turned president who would rather be in movies than being president. So he is going to step down, and she basically back her, and then hilarity ensues when she hires Seth Rogen, the weird kid who she used to babysit, as her speechwriter, who is now a journalist who has just quit because there's a lot of shit going on in this. He's just quit because this Fox News-esque thing is going to take over, which is run by an almost unrecognizable Andy Serkis. Like, I didn't know what he was going to look like, but I knew Andy Serkis was in it. And if I didn't know at all that Andy Serkis was in it, it probably would have taken me a lot longer to realize it was him. So that's like all the stuff that's going on here. And then eventually it's just going to be a romantic comedy about the two of them trying to find romance together in this setting, despite their awkward past together. The joke basically being that he kissed her unannounced back when he was 13 and she was his babysitter, and he got this hard-on that wouldn't go away. So, yes, the whole relationship between the two of them stems from a boner joke. Would you expect any less or more from a Seth Rogen movie? Don't worry, weed and other drugs will find their way into this as well. But there is something biting about the humor here sometimes. Particularly in the sense of the way they kind of try to... it sort of seems like they're trying to find the humor in regards to both sides, like, politically. Which, for a comedy like this, that's a really fine line they're walking, and they're going to have, like, something really clever up their sleeve to be able to do this in, like, a really competent way that feels really smart and clever and all that. And every now and then it kind of finds its way in. When you've got lines like, when he's talking about the news that Andy Serkis runs, and he says that, they're a propaganda machine, and he says, not the good kind, the kind that's wrong. And they play with that joke a little bit, where Rogen's character doesn't see the irony in what he's talking about when he, like, really goes after one thing. But for the most part, it's weed, drugs, sex movie. It's a Seth Rogen movie. That's basically trying to class itself up by casting Charlize Theron as his love interest, and sort of the main character here. And while they do have chemistry, that's something that I've been seeing people say a lot, and what the movie's sort of foundation is and why they think the movie succeeds is the chemistry. The chemistry is so great. Oh my god, the chemistry. How shocking is it that of all people, Charlize and Seth Rogen have great chemistry? And it's like, it's really actually not. That's surprising, because they're both talented people. Because Charlize is Charlize, obviously, and then you've got Seth Rogen, who I go after for sort of having the same style of humor, but Seth Rogen has also made me laugh hysterically many, many, many times over, and he's also had me on the verge of crying and stuff like Take This Waltz. So, regardless of what I say about how routine his movies are and their jokes, he's clearly talented. Nobody is questioning that. So, yeah, when you put them together, they're probably going to find chemistry when you have two people this talented doing this. But then that's the thing, though, is I think one of the things they're trying to do here to subvert all this is that the will they get together or will they won't thing is handled relatively early, especially for a movie that breaks 2 hours. It's like 40 or 45 minutes in, I think, when they almost practically become, a couple of sorts. They just have to start hiding what they do because of her whole reputation and the fact that she's running for president now, basically. Yeah, and from then on you can pretty much see exactly where it's going to go, and there's not much else after that that really subverts anything. It's sort of... And it is that kind of thing where it's like, it doesn't necessarily have to subvert the cliche. If it does the cliche in a way that succeeds, then it doesn't matter if it's a cliche or not, if it works. But I don't really feel like they accomplished either that much. And like I said, it's really broken up, too, in regards to... For pretty much every single moment, we get a scene that's... Since the scenes didn't really work for me that were trying to be sincere, really any of them. And, like, the scenes where they're starting to fall for each other really felt still pretty routine, especially the fact that it's one of those movies that does that whole thing where they see that they've got something, minuscule in common, and it's charming that they find that connection. and then the rest of their connection is done in montage, and we're just supposed to basically go on one scene that led us to this, so that when the montage is over, we are at the point to where they're like really, really into each other, regardless of how different they seemed at the start. And then it's just kind of that for the rest of it. And yeah, they'll have one scene where they like dance and they sing together and all that, but it all just feels like it's just really easy. You just write in the script, they dance and sing, and then the actors work it out. The actors make it believable that they're falling for each other, and it's solely reliant on them. The writing's not trying to do anything clever with this whatsoever, or anything different whatsoever. And that's the thing is, even though they work together, Rogan and Charlize do, I just didn't really feel anything about it. It didn't feel any different in any particular way. They weren't people that it was like, oh my god, I really, really hope this works out for them. I just was kind of watching the events happen. And for every time they're not doing the something cliche to say, hey, this is the part where they really like each other, it's a drug or a sex joke that we've seen before. The joke with the security guard when he goes in and he's like, well, let's see how this goes down, I've got this on me, and it's like, it's weed, and it's like, oh no, but then he just keeps pulling out other drugs that are getting like harder as he pulls them out. And it's like, I feel like this scene, if this weren't the fact that this is exactly what we expect Rogan to do, this is exactly the kind of humor we expect, this probably could have been a great scene. And something really funny, especially with how it sort of somewhat builds on itself. But it's like, it's just like, nope, this is exactly the scene I expected in this movie. One of many similar to it. And then we get a couple of, funny sex moments, whether it be the two of them together or Rogan by himself. So, the thing about this is that, number one, this is a movie where, as far as their relationship goes, we already know exactly where it's headed because it's so heavily advertised. Once again, as if this is some unbelievable thing. Charlize Theron and Seth Rogen have sex scenes, and we're going to build that up in all the marketing, talk about it in all the interviews. They did, like, every single damn interview in the history of ever, I think. They were so desperate about the fact that they were the week after Endgame. And they were really trying to build it up. They were really building up the critical acclaim. They did every talk show / interview / whatever around the entire country, I think. And all of this is exactly what... They build it up like it's going to be this whole big thing. But the thing is like, it's... They're still trying to do this sex sells thing, which is, like, ancient. And it's really nothing... There's nothing here that we didn't see Seth Rogen do and Knocked Up when, if you must put it this way, he was significantly less attractive, hence it was more of a gimmick. So, yeah, and there's even that whole feel of it. The June Diane Raphael character is basically the Leslie Mann character in Knocked Up, and he gets the scene where he stands up to her and says, hey, we care about each other, and your remarks towards me, don't mean shit, or whatever. It feels like this whole same setup here, and Knocked Up is, 2007, so 12 years. 12 years old Knocked Up is now. And we're trying to do that again, and Knocked Up's not even a movie I'm crazy about to begin with. And it's like we're basically trying to recapture that and still play up 12 years later. And Knocked Up was like Seth Rogen's first venture into being the face of a movie. So like then at least it made sense they were playing it up like that. But since then he's played Rose Byrne's husband twice, among whoever the hell else. Who was it? Was it Cameron Diaz in The Green Hornet? Just about Elizabeth Banks. And it's like, this is not some subversion whatsoever. That they're trying to play up, and then there's the funny sex scene, which I've talked about many times before, where it's really, really difficult to pull off the funny sex scene, because so many movies have tried it. Even good movies, even movies that are actually funny, have failed trying to do the funny sex scene. And once again, yeah, there's nothing to. I think the one I talked about recently was there's a funny sex scene in Your Sister's Sister, and this is more or less the same joke. Um, but yeah, so there's that. And then we've got the scene of Seth Rogen by himself. And the thing is that this comes back 2 or 3 times. And what's interesting about this is we actually see it happen, mainly for the shock value, to get the shock laugh of them actually showing what he's done to himself, which, interestingly enough, becomes a plot point, which I guess is kind of a compliment that they could pull that off to make it like a significant plot point that this happens. But the thing about the shock value of showing it, and that's where the big laugh comes from, is that immediately after that, because he yells in a way as it happens, but then the very next scene is him watching the video, and we don't see the video this time, but when we hear that yell off screen, knowing what he's watching, I thought that was significantly funnier than the scene just prior to it where they showed the video. Like, just hearing it and knowing what that is was so much funnier. And then it comes back a third time, and it was still, the second time they don't show it, it's funnier than the first time they show it when they did. So yeah, you don't have to go all up in it. It's 2019. There is so much stuff that was shocking, like, in the late 90s, early 2000s. I mean, you can take this back to the early 80s if you want to. It goes back a long-ass way since they've been able to show these kind of jokes in comedies. So it doesn't really have much of an impact anymore. You've got to really, really do something that's, like, really kind of out of fucking nowhere. And this movie doesn't have any of that. The big, like, there's certainly not enough of the, like, big laughs that you might expect. Just here and there. Like, another one of the funnier scenes is the first scene, when he's, like, undercover in a white supremacist group. And he's saying, you know, like, he's trying to basically fit in here, and the way he says, like, oh yeah, you know, I'm one of you guys, you know, I mean, white power, obviously, just when just stuff like that is what works. But the movie tries many times to go big, and that's really where it's most likely to not succeed. I mean, that's any case. Where if you try to go as big, the bigger you go, the bigger you can fail. But this to me, it never really paid off when it tried to go big. And it only occasionally paid off when they went a little smaller and just tried for, like, one line. So, yeah, so this wasn't really doing much for me at all. And there's the whole thing of, when he's at the function or whatever it is, and Junai Raphael dresses him up in a stupid manner to basically humiliate him. And Charlize is just laughing her ass off at what he looks like. And I started to realize that they should probably be panicking if there's a character in the movie that's laughing harder than we are. Then there's probably something wrong. Then there's the whole Boys to Men thing, and the Lil Yachty thing, where they bring in it basically just felt like a rehash of the Backstreet Boys thing. And this is the end, where it's like, oh, they're actually there. And they were, you know, much more popular at one time than they are now, but here they are. Blast from the past, whatever, which I think is supposed to be funny in itself, especially with the way it kept cutting back to them performing throughout this scene when it really has nothing to do with it except to be background noise. I don't know what the intended purpose is, but, so there's that. And then there's all the, funnily enough, given their box office competition, there's a lot of Marvel movie references for whatever reason. Like, she hasn't seen, like, she knows Encino Man by heart, which I just rewatched, like, last week, which was really weird. And then they start making a whole bunch of Marvel references. Like, there's the scene where they're watching The Winter Soldier. And then, just completely and totally out of place, a scene happens to them that kind of mirrors the scene they're watching in Winter Soldier, and it kind of turns into an action movie for like 10 minutes. And then, like I said, there are times where it wants to be really serious. Every now and then they kind of balance the supposed seriousness with something comedic. Like, there's a moment where Rogan goes out onto the beach, and it's like he's trying to be real contemplative and stuff like that, and then they just kind of play it off with a joke. But still, just the scenes like that just really don't fit no matter how sincere they're trying to be. Especially the bigger your comedy tries to go, the more of a not so great contrast the attempts to be serious are going to be. And yes, of course, because it's an over 2 hour movie, and Seth Rogen comes from the Judd Apatow school of putting his movies together, it is going to get serious for like the entire last half hour, and they're going to go their separate ways, and they're going to sulk for way too damn long before, you gotta really hope they find each other in the crowd or whatever, and it's the same old shit we've been seeing since the beginning of time. So, there is that. And, of course, it's not without a party montage, because what would a modern comedy be without dragging out its runtime, being over 2 hours, with one or two party montages on top of all the other stuff that's just really dragging it out. So, you've got a winning supporting cast. I mentioned, June Diane Raphael, then you've also got O'Shea Jackson Jr., you've got Alexander Skarsgård, who's barely fucking there, Lisa Kudrow, who has, like, one scene, Andy Serkis is there, like, once or twice before he's important at the end, but by then, it hardly matters. There's hardly anything he can do with it at that point. Randall Park pops up again. It's always nice to see Randall Park, but it seems like he's likes to pop up for all of 30 seconds in a lot of movies now. So, that's what it is. I mean, people are really taking to this, so good for those people. But, like I said, unless they just kind of really go all out in a way that I don't even know. I don't even know what I would suggest, but this kind of thing is just, it just feels like the same old shit to me. And like I said, there are ways to do the same old shit to make it really work and really appealing. Oftentimes through your actors, like the attempt that they make, but for me it just didn't get there, and it's still just all the stuff on the very, very surface that it so clearly is from the get-go. So that's what that is. I don't remember what next week is. Is John Wick next week? I think it might be. So I'm gonna have to like really, really like weasel my way in time in order to get to John Wick, but I'm pretty sure that should probably happen. So hopefully that won't be an issue. And then whatever else comes along. So there's that. I'm gonna do the Twilight Zone thing finally. There's another Versus. There's a giant 2-part catch-up video, sort of like I did at the end of last year. So, yeah, so that's what we're looking at for now. So until all of that stuff, I think that's it for